and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast, where if you are watching this rather than listening, you will notice that we're in a rather special location. We're in an electric vehicle workshop in Warwickshire, and no, we are not at Jaguar Land Rover, we are not at Aston Martin, we are in fact with a very, very special company called Ox Delivers, who make incredible Flatpack, super durable electric vans, which they build and operate in Rwanda. And we're here to find out exactly how they create these incredible vans and operate a service which has been referred to as Uber for potatoes. So very shortly, I'm going to be sitting down with CEO and co-founder Simon Davis to find out all about Ox Delivers. But before we get there, a very, very quick advert break. Love everything electric? Join us live in the South this October and in Australia, London and Canada in 2025. Simon, thank you so much for inviting us here to your wonderful facility here in Warwickshire. We have so much to cover, but I wonder if you could kick us off by just painting a picture for us. Who is Ox Delivers and what are you trying to do?
So we're all about supercharging trade in Africa. And we're here in Warwickshire because we're designing this, the first purpose-designed electric truck for the dirt road, moving goods on dirt roads. And you might say, what's the connection between those two? Well, here, outside there's a field of potatoes, and when the farmer's harvests his potatoes, he picks up a phone and a whole logistics chain swings into action, and before you know it, the potatoes are in your shopping trolley and you're taking them home. It's not like that everywhere. If you're a farmer in East Africa, you're picking those potatoes, you're putting them in plastic sacks, 150 kilos at a time, you're then loading them on top of your bicycle. So it's like putting two of your mates on the back of your bike and then pushing them to the local town. And that is slow, it's expensive, it's dangerous. And at Ox Delivers, we're about making that trade affordable, reliable and clean.
So there's quite a few components of the business model that I want to go on to, because I've seen in a few articles that you're described as the Uber for potatoes, and that is something that I want to explore in a lot more detail.
Yeah.
But before I do, I know that you currently have trucks operating in Rwanda, a market where typically they would import trucks and vans and cars, maybe at the kind of towards the end of their life. And as such, they're not particularly fit for purpose, not least because the road conditions in Rwanda are not necessarily fabulous. So I wonder if you could describe for us why the existing vehicles currently used are not fit for purpose and how this may differ.
Yeah, so you're right. In Africa, upwards of 90% of vehicles are imported used, sometimes very used. Like in Nigeria, a quarter of all vehicles imported are 19 years old at the point of import. 19 years old? Yes.
Wow.
It's extraordinary. And then they have, so none of them were ever designed for the conditions on the continent where, in Rwanda, for example, only 10% of roads are paved. So the trucks are then spending most of their lives on dirt roads, which are, dusty and bumpy in the dry season. They're rivers of mud in the rainy season. And so they get trashed, essentially.
Oh my God, my sister and brother-in-law have finally admitted defeat on their 19-year-old Seat Alhambra. And I have concerns about them driving to my house, let alone if they're operating on sort of unpaved roads. So you've had to design this and you've had to make it so much more fit for purpose. Now, going through your website and doing a little bit of research, the original vehicle, I believe, was designed by Gordan, who is perhaps best known for designing the McLaren F1, quite far removed from something like this that is a little bit more utilitarian. However, I also understand that there were several things that he designed that you had to kind of unpick to make this even more fit for purpose. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, so Gordan was involved back in the start of the project, and he does say it's one of the most important projects that he's ever worked on. The focus from the very beginning was about building a simple and effective vehicle for running on these kind of roads. Nobody's designed a vehicle for use on dirt roads since, say, the Land Cruiser 70, which was launched in the early 80s. But part of the challenge of building a successful business is not just the product, it's also the business model. So what we've been doing since Ox Delivers started 3 years ago is that we've been developing a business model that enables us to get that product into the hands of the people who really need it.
Okay, I think it's time for us to talk about this business model, because this is where I think things get really, really fascinating. So, some of the things I've read is that you've said that for electric vehicles, the sales model doesn't necessarily work. Not least because that means that vehicles have to be pretty expensive, and not least because you're also having to have some planned redundancy such that those vehicles have a set operating time, and eventually at the end of operating time, you'll buy a new vehicle. And in economies like Rwanda, that simply does not stack up. But an operating model does. What does that mean?
Well, I think we have to, first of all, recognise how the car trade works in the UK, right? If I want to go and buy a new car, I'm actually going to buy it on finance. It's not going to be me that buys it, it's the bank. And you go to Africa, less than half of people have a bank account, let alone the ability to raise finance. So access to capital is a massive issue. You know, the reason all these vehicles are imported used is because people don't have the capital to buy new vehicles. But then you also have to sort of question how the business model works here. You know, my mates built a camper van on a conversion of an ex-delivery van, but it was a delivery van that was defleeted at only 4 years old, which is crazy, right? And so Mercedes are building a Mercedes Sprinter and then expecting their first customers to come back and buy another one after 4 years. Like 40 years ago, Mercedes used to build vehicles that lasted for 30, 40 years. Now the model has changed. And so if you switch to a service-based model, it completely changes the incentives for us. So we don't ever want to take these vehicles off the road, right? We want them to last 20, 30 years. And when they do get to the end of their life, we want to harvest the parts that are left and put them back onto new vehicles. And actually, EVs make a lot of sense, because the reason you scrap most cars is because there's a problem with the engine, right? And EVs, we know how long Tesla batteries are lasting. You know, you don't have very much maintenance to do. So there's a huge opportunity to really change the business model. And instead of building for redundancy, actually building for service, building for a long operating life.
So building for service, so let me just check if I've got this right, because this is going to be the Uber for potatoes bit of this. So instead of someone just ringing you up, buying a vehicle, owning it, using it till it's destructed, and then buying a new one, you're actually doing this much more as kind of vehicle as a service model. So if I was a farmer in Rwanda, how does that work? How do I interact with ox delivers?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of a chili pepper farmer called Jean-Pierre, and his route to market used to be chili peppers onto a bicycle and push them to the nearest town, then put them on the roof of a bus, which takes him across Rwanda. Then when he arrives at the bus station in Kigali, he would then get a moto taxi, put them on the back of a motorbike and take them to the export point and sell chili peppers. What he does now is he rings up Ox Delivers and books a space on the back of a truck. We come and collect his goods, we deliver them straight to the delivery point. And instead of having a 2-day round trip, he's doing it in 3 or 4 hours. And obviously that means it's so much more productive. He can spend much more time on his farm and much less time traveling. So he's gone from doing, he used to do 1 trip a fortnight with 300 or 400 kilos, but can you imagine taking 300 or 400 kilos of chili peppers on a bus? He now sends 2 trucks a week. So he's more than 10x'd his business because he can get goods to market.
That is absolutely unbelievable. And okay, this might be a stupid question, but presumably he was traveling with the chili peppers before. He's now sending them and then they're dealt with at the other end, or is he also on the truck as well?
So no, we deal with it for him most of the time, because the reason people travel with their goods is because the trade isn't reliable. Like here, no farmer would travel with their goods, taking them to market. We know the systems work. And this is why our overall vision is all about supercharging trade, because we're going from a situation of people having to physically carry their goods and go with them to make sure they get paid and all that. At Ox, we handle that transaction for them.
Oh my gosh, okay. I have so many other questions. This is like opening up Pandora's box. Which direction are we going to go in? So, from your sense then, you own the vehicles, and then your sort of business model is that you basically lease out space in a truck. Okay, so, and does that mean that, anyone can book a slot and they might not have to take up the whole space, but they might be sharing the space with various other farmers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a key part of the business model, because to fill a whole truck worth of goods is a lot of it requires a lot of stuff, right? Farms in Africa typically are much smaller scale than we're used to here. There hasn't been the consolidation. So we can enable someone to use transport when their other option would be a bicycle. But it also applies all the way through to big corporates. So we serve, a big fish farm in Rwanda, and their real challenge is they have limited amounts of capital, they're venture backed, but they really want to be spending their investment on fish farming equipment, cages, freezers, fish processing facilities. They don't want to be spending all that capital on vehicles, and they don't have the third-party logistics providers that we would have. They can't just ring up Eddie Stobart. There aren't businesses like that in the market.
And so, okay, I'm going to check my notes here, because one of the things that I read in my research is that currently, for example, the price of bananas, they cost 10 times more in the city than they do in the villages, and that's because that logistics cost is currently so expensive, and obviously farmers need to recoup that cost. So are you seeing anecdotally that actually are farmers making bigger margins, or are the prices coming down in cities?
Well, you're right. You get these huge price deltas because essentially if you're a farmer, particularly if you have a good year, the people around you also have a good year. So prices actually fall. But in the cities, if you can't reach the tomatoes, they're worthless to you. The value is always created in the movement. And if I give you an example of one of our clients is a lady called Beatrice, who's a wholesaler of tomatoes. So she was buying tomatoes from farmers. They would bring them down from the hills to a local market. She would buy them there, and then she's got three options. She can walk with them, put them on her head, put them on a bicycle, or wait for a bus, and she used the bus. But waiting for a bus can be a multi-day affair, right? And all the time you're sitting by the side of the road, you'll sleep there so nobody steals your tomatoes. And obviously the value of your tomatoes is going down because they're sat in the sunshine. And and so since working with Ox, she's gone from trading about $70 a day in tomatoes to $700 a day.
Wow.
And that's enabled her to buy a piece of land for a couple of $1,000s. And she actually, the best bit is she wants to build a house. And she told me last time I was in Rwanda that she was going to call it the Ox House because we've made it possible for her to do that.
So the potential impact, is absolutely huge. What's the scale of your operation currently?
So to date, we've served about 5,000 customers, which has really enabled us to prove this model works, right? That was the big question is, can people afford to pay for transport? That's why other car businesses don't go to Africa. They perceive there's no market there, but we've generated significant revenues from real paying customers. But that's a tiny fraction of the market. Rwanda is 13 million people alone, East Africa 300 million, and it's a market that's growing enormously. Africa will be the most populous continent very soon, and is doubling in population over the next 20 years.
Talk to me about the process of actually booking a slot in the truck, because I've read that 80% of Rwandese don't have access to a smartphone, and there's that huge kind of digital accessibility must be a component that you have to consider in all of this as well.
Yeah, there's smartphone penetration is lower. I think it's probably more than 80% have access. 2G phone penetration is very high. Almost all business people will have a 2G phone. And so right now we have a short dial number, so you dial a 4-digit number in Rwanda to book a ride. We also have plans for what's called a USSD app. So you might remember from back in the day when you had a pay-as-you-go phone, you could put a code in, it would tell you what your credit was. Now, we don't really use it in the UK, but that's heavily used for things like mobile money in Africa. And so it's kind of like having an SMS conversation with a machine. And so we can build an app that enables people to book a ride much more simply than you would over the phone. Obviously we're talking here about logistics, right? People's farms don't move, for example. So people can have a couple of saved locations of where they're delivering from and to, and you can do most of the transactions you'd need to do just by a 2G phone.
So you have operations here in Warwickshire. The engineering team
Yep.
is based here in Warwickshire. Are you shipping these vehicles straight to Rwanda like this? And the reason I ask is because they look to me pretty Flatpack assembly proofed.
Yes.
How do you ship them?
Yeah, so today we're shipping shipping fully built vehicles, but the plan absolutely is to get to Flatpack. That was one of the core innovations back from the original start of the project, was recognizing building vehicles is complex, right? You know, there is, outside of South Africa and the very northern countries in Africa, there is next to no manufacturing and very, very little of vehicles. You know, VW have a plant in Rwanda, but it's putting steering wheels on and fitting side windows. So what Flatpack enables us to do is ship efficiently. We can get 6 of these in a container, and then we put them together in market. So we can take Rwanda on the journey from building kits to fully built vehicles over a period of time and build up those local skills and capability.
Also, just want to pause on the fact, 6 of these in one shipping container. That
Yes.
is an extremely efficient way to ship a vehicle.
Yeah, and this is one of the things about approaching the business model of the automotive industry afresh. You know, lots of companies do CKD, knock down, build, but almost always they build the vehicle and then take it apart and then ship it. Whereas what we've done is thought about the value chain from the scratch. And so by flat packing them, we can reduce our shipping costs, we can drive more local content, and obviously that then helps when we come into maintenance and things like that, because we've got the skills in country.
So I need to ask you about charging infrastructure, because Rwanda is a really interesting country in that the grid is already 60% powered by renewables, but only 75% of people are currently connected to the grid. So they've got an interesting challenge in that they're rapidly decarbonising, but also having to rapidly expand their grid at the same time. I imagine that presents various challenges from a charging infrastructure perspective.
Yeah, so Rwanda has a very green grid. Actually, you know, Kenya is even greener, it's 90+% green, because there's so much hydro, geothermal, obviously solar opportunity. And so there's a lot of investment going into clean energy. And one of the things about Africa is the level of growth means they're building lots of things from scratch. So they're not dealing with old infrastructure. Like, you know, they've never built a landline infrastructure. They went straight to mobile phones. And that's a real opportunity with vehicles as well, you know, going straight to EV, skipping out diesel vehicle ownership. The good thing about what we're doing is obviously we're commercial logistics. So our routes are planned and they're known and they're stable, and therefore charging can be done at base. We don't need chargers spread all over the country. And so our trucks are charged basically each night at home. And we position those bases on the major grid lines. And you talk about like the electrification levels, and that's household electrification. And one of the key challenges there is if you connect a household, you might spend $1 or $2 a month on energy, and that doesn't make any economic sense. What's great about electric vehicles is you put $20 of electricity into this and you'll make $200 in revenue. So the economics of it are superb. So actually, EVs are a great way to drive electrification, because you're building the economy and driving productivity. And obviously, as you do that, then people can afford to electrify their homes as well. You've got to start with the most productive use of energy, and actually a fridge is not a particularly productive use, right? It's convenience, not value add.
And there's a number of interesting EV incentives within Rwanda, from what I understand. Talk to us about those.
Yeah, because it's really in the interests of the government to go EV. Like, Africa biggest import is oil, and it's sending dollars out the country to buy oil. And so going EV replaces that with a locally generated source, creates value in the country. So, for example, as an EV operator, we get access to the industrial level tariff from day one. So your charger isn't charged at domestic rates, it's charged at industrial rates. There are reduced import duties for EVs because they can see the real advantages to the economy.
It's really evident to me that we're kind of on a precipice of seeing a huge step change within the economy and within sort of the appetite for new technologies, electrification, et cetera, within East African countries. And actually, I read recently that BYD has just announced that it will partner with Rwanda-based electric motorbike company Ampersand to build 40,000 bikes in Rwanda and Kenya. So clearly things are going to change pretty substantially. What would you anticipate happening over the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
That's a tough question. There's just so much opportunity. One thing, the growth over the next 5 to 10 years, you know, the workforce will have increased by 75%, I think, in that sort of time frame. And, you know, there is no reason why, you know, EVs can't dominate the landscape if we get the right business models, right? The classic, expecting consumers to buy them is not going to happen. But with models like this, and also Ampersand, who are doing they're doing electric motorbikes. Motorbikes are the dominant taxi in East Africa, and it's cheaper to operate an electric motorbike than it is to run a petrol one. So it just makes sense. Same as here, it's cheaper for us to run EVs with our business model than it is to run diesels, and so it can be the dominant opportunity.
So I know that your background is in traditional automotive engineering.
Yeah.
Like many people, your background was at Jaguar Land Rover. I've made this joke many times in this podcast, but all roads stem from Leamington Spa. It certainly seems that way. But so I want to know a little bit more about the engineering that's gone into this vehicle, because unlike a Range Rover or a Jaguar, you've had a vastly different engineering challenge here. You've had to create something that can be hugely durable, that it can last a long time, and then it makes sense from an operating point of view. What were some of the things that you put on that kind of initial design criteria?
Yeah, so obviously the roads are the biggest difference. Most products are designed, even off-road products are designed for 90+% tarmac and a little bit of dirt. We see from our data that our trucks are spending half their time on dirt roads in the current operations. So, and in the summer, in the dry season, they're dusty and they're bumpy. In the rainy season, they're rivers of mud. So resilience is really important. Durability is really important. But overall, the most important thing is total cost of ownership. This is a huge market, but it's an extremely price-sensitive market. And so we have to deliver a total cost of ownership that's 1/10 of the local alternative. And actually, that's a really refreshing approach. Our whole model with the circularity is, really changes how you think about it, because we're prepared to invest money in the vehicle in order to deliver lower running costs. My journey at Jaguar Land Rover, started as chassis engineer, worked in strategy for a long time, and then ended up in building software. And we've taken a lot of lessons from the way the software industry build vehicles, because thinking about, for example, data and monitoring vehicles in use, consistently updating vehicles, and so that we can really drive that low cost of ownership. It's not about trim levels or model years, it's about how do you move stuff cheaply on dirt roads.
I also just want to pause on 1/10 of the operating cost of the local alternative.
Yeah.
That is phenomenal.
Yeah, and the reason is the local alternative is insanely expensive. So, I've talked about the conditions already, right? When we started 3 years ago, one of the first things we did was we wanted to test the market. Can people afford to pay? How does all this work? And so we went to Rwanda and we rented a truck. That in itself was expensive. We were paying $1,000 a month to rent a fairly well-used pickup, because there's just a shortage of vehicles. And then we ran it, delivering goods for our customers. And what we found was we spent as much money on fuel as we did on maintenance. So can you imagine going to the garage and every time you put 80 quid in the tank, you're also getting an 80 quid repair bill? And it's a function of the fact the vehicles weren't designed for the conditions, you're running fully laden, on dirt roads. And so to run a pickup in Rwanda costs you 5 times more than it does here. So, and we all know EVs are cheaper than diesels, right, to run, because of the energy costs and the maintenance costs. So, it's 10 times cheaper than the local alternative. Basically means it's half the price of running a Hilux in the UK.
Wow. And I think that sort of emphasises the point that actually there's a huge transportation equity piece here.
Yes.
And how we need to consider this isn't just about powertrains and having clean electric vehicles. This is around allowing people access to transportation, which, as we know, gives them access to business, social opportunities, voting, healthcare, all those good things. Yeah. And it's so vital that it is affordable within specific markets.
Yeah. We're so used to having easily available transport here. We just don't even think about it. But ultimately, this country was built on the back of a massive navy. We want to send something somewhere. You pick up the phone, you go on the internet. It just happens. We're so used to it. But actually, as soon as you don't have it, so many things. Amazon doesn't exist in Africa because they can't deliver. A few people have tried to copy them. It doesn't work. So many opportunities. You can have a diamond ring, but if I can't get it to you, it is worthless to you. And we don't think about that problem, but it's a huge problem for about 3 billion people on the planet.
Wow. And it's so interesting that you actually started with understanding how the operations work before you went away and designed a vehicle. Was that, talk to me how you became involved in this project in the first place.
So I worked at JLR for many years. I heard about the project. I think I read originally about it in Autocar. My wife stuffed it under my nose. And so I got a little bit involved, met a few of the people, pitched it into Land Rover a couple of times. But ultimately, it's such a different approach that you can't get your head around it when you're sat in a big automotive. So I left Jaguar Land Rover as part of the redundancies in 2019 and was kind of wondering about what to do. And so I volunteered to help. And they said, well, our only employee is leaving. He's part-time and underemployed, so why don't you have a go? And so kind of, I started looking around. My co-founder Natalie joined after 6 months. We started doing more research. We applied for some grants and then ultimately won some funding from Innovate UK and the Advanced Propulsion Centre, and that enabled us to hire. And I drove the prototype we had to my first investor's house and parked it on his drive, and we got our first investment, and that hired the first team of 9. And we've just grown from there, and we're at 127 people now.
127?
Yeah, so 2/3 of the team are in Rwanda, physically delivering stuff, and then we've got a team here in the UK. Well, most of the engineering is done in the UK. We've got some engineers in Kenya, and then a few people around the world who do the business stuff.
Oh my goodness. That's quite a phenomenal ride that's quite an incredible pandemic that you had, to be honest.
Yes, it was. Yeah, I was working at home on my own before the pandemic made it trendy. And then, when we originally started, we used to meet in a church hall because, we'd meet up once a week because that was kind of all you were allowed to do. And we were fully remote for the first couple of years.
So it must be really quite amazing to be able to see that you've got 4,000 customers. That's absolutely astonishing growth. But what happens from here?
What happens from here? Grow, grow, grow. So, we've got some big announcements coming over the next few weeks. Yeah, this is a huge opportunity. In fast forward a few years, we'll have hundreds of trucks running on the road, serving tens of thousands of customers.
Do people always get it? Because I imagine you've had to have quite a few conversations where people are like, oh, what are you up to, Simon? You're like, oh, well, I'm doing this thing called Ox Delivers. We're moving to a new, different kind of operating model where it's sort of a transport as a service rather than you have to buy a van. And I imagine some people are like, oh, right. Do people get it?
Those that get it absolutely love it. And some people are a bit confused by it. It is, I think what is critical, and if you look at all the successful startups, they change the business model and change the product. Both come together, whether it's Tesla with the dealer model or whether it's mobile phones where you bundle the mobile phone with the contract. It does require a level of change, and it's not a market many people are familiar with. But that doesn't mean it's any less of an opportunity, right? It's the best opportunities are hidden in plain sight, and this is definitely one of those.
So a slightly more existential question for you.
Yeah.
Because, whenever we do anything on particularly big SUVs on the channel, invariably there'll be comments saying, oh, brilliant, more massive, oversized vehicles for people that don't need them. And we need smaller, cheaper, lighter electric vehicles. But we could also argue that actually we need fewer vehicles that last longer, that we have more of these kind of transport of a service models. Do you think there's a space for something like this in the UK and in European markets?
I think there's transport as a service is definitely a revolution that's coming. None of the existing manufacturers have managed to really get it. They've tried, but it's not worked because, you're right. We build vehicles and they sit still most of the time. That doesn't make any sense. And obviously in the West, the big barrier is the cost of drivers. We'd all be using Uber if we didn't have to pay drivers anything. But autonomy hasn't quite come, and the point it does come is going to be a transformational change, right? Because why would I own an autonomous vehicle? I just go on my phone and press a button and it will be fine. In emerging markets, the driver cost is significantly lower, so they can actually go there sooner to this shared model. And to my mind, we all know EVs are going to unlock a cost of ownership save versus diesels. In my view, this move to a as a service-based model is at least a bigger change again, because we should be building vehicles that last decades. We should be constantly refining and improving those vehicles, and it will completely change how we think about products. we wouldn't, you just look at how Spotify has changed music collection, or Netflix has changed video ownership, right? We wouldn't even dream of owning those things now. Like, why do we own vehicles? Why, and it's partly because we've spent the last 100 years persuading people that cars are an extension of our personality. They're not really, but it's a good way of getting people to put their hands in the pocket.
It's so interesting, you're absolutely right, because I bet most people listening to this podcast at some stage have either still got a big box of DVDs stashed away in a loft somewhere, or are like, God, why on earth did we buy these in the first place?
Yeah, we'd never go back, right? And it's kind of one of the transition to as a service is the same. It's hardest in the markets where you've got the most embedded. The people who switched to Netflix last were the ones with the biggest DVD collection. The same is true of vehicles. We've got the biggest car collection in the West, so we will switch to as a service later. In Africa, they don't have a big car collection, so as a service just makes sense. Why would I buy one? I can just use this.
And I think from an innovation perspective, it's really interesting looking at some of the things going on in various African countries whereby they have, as you say, leapfrogged certain things. For example, landlines and going straight to internet-enabled phones.
Yeah.
In this instance, maybe leapfrogging private vehicle ownership to transport as a service models.
Yeah.
So I mean, it has been, no question, an extremely successful 5 years since you've been in this business. Yeah. But I imagine at points extremely stressful as well. What have been some of the really big meaty challenges along the way?
We're doing something here that's a bit different, right? And as much as people who invest in innovation like to say they support innovation, they also like to invest in things that they can get their heads around and that are normal, right? Everybody wants to invest in AI at the moment. Guess why? Because AI is the trendy thing, and this isn't the trendy thing, right? And so that's been a real challenge, really explaining to people about a situation that's outside of most of their people's experience, and mobilising capital, I guess, has been our biggest challenge. There's lots of other engineering challenges and people challenges. Building a business that spans a couple of continents, getting the right people who can really kind of take a fresh approach. Like there's lots of engineers, but we're very used to, as engineers, optimizing things to build big, expensive, shiny cars. Thinking about things about how do we actually deliver vehicles that last a long time, that live in tough environments, is a skill you have to learn.
So what kind of mindset do you try to cultivate within the engineers and workforce here?
Well, I think we aim for a data-driven situation. One of the big opportunities of as a service is that you continue to own the vehicle, so you know what happens to them. You're not guessing from service records. You can actually monitor the vehicle. So making sure that we're pulling data and using that to drive decisions. We also have a big focus on teamwork here. I'm a passionate believer that teams is what delivers, and making sure we share information with people. We can all make good decisions, but not if we don't have the data. So it comes back to data again, like making sure we're using data, sharing it properly to enable good decisions.
And if you could whisper something in your ear of your 2019 self, what would you say?
Well, Elon Musk has a good quote about, running businesses is like eating glass. And I think that's perhaps a bit harsh. There's some really big upsides to running a business, and, being able to start from scratch and really shape things in a way. I guess I'd probably say keep going. It might yet work, because it's uncertainty. There is you have to build your own momentum and keep your own momentum. We've seen all the challenges of the other EV startups have faced over the last few years. You have to make your own success, and so continuing to focus on that is the key, I think.
Well, honestly, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. Thank you so much for sharing with us all of the story behind this incredible vehicle. And personally, I think we should have a fully charged trip out to Rwanda, I think.
It'll be a lot of fun. It's a very beautiful country. And yeah, you'll be able to see the impact on the ground of how it changes people's lives. And that's the great thing about Ox, right? Is we've got some exciting engineering challenges. We're making a real difference to people in terms of their ability to, build successful businesses and access healthcare and education and all those other things. And it's good for the climate. Like it's a real win-win-win business.
I personally really enjoyed that conversation with Simon, and I think it is so amazing that companies like Ox Delivers exist that aren't just looking at creating clean transportation, but transportation that is inclusive and can unlock huge economic opportunities. So if you enjoyed this episode, or if you find Ox Delivers interesting, please do share this episode and spread the word that they exist. Now, if I could ask for one little favour before you go, if you could like, comment, follow or subscribe, it would be so appreciated. It really helps to ensure that we can keep covering important and interesting topics in this clean energy transition. But that's it. That's all we have time for. If you have been, thank you for listening.